I was 22, fresh out of school, and needed a job, any job. So I took a security guard position at an industrial park on the absolute fringe of the city. My shift was a lonely stretch, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and my workspace was a small windowed trailer, or what we called the guard shack. The industrial park itself was nothing special: a fenced-in yard, a big warehouse, and a few shipping containers filled with construction supplies. But what made it memorable was what lay immediately behind the chain-link fence on the north side: the Black Forest. It was vast, dense, and even in the daytime, it felt oppressive. People said locals only went in there if they wanted to disappear. I considered myself a practical guy. I believed in logic, not local legends. For the first month, the job was just 8 hours of boredom, punctuated by bad internet and lukewarm coffee. Until the silence began. It wasn't normal nighttime quiet. It was a straining, heavy silence, the kind that hurts your ears. All the natural sounds that should have been there, the rustling of leaves, the hooting of owls, the nocturnal rustling of small animals, simply vanished. It was a complete acoustic void. I was sitting in the shack around 2 a.m. trying to watch a movie on my laptop when this silence washed over the area. I tried to convince myself it was just some atmospheric anomaly, but the vacuum was too profound. And then, into that perfect silence, came a sound. It wasn't a snap or a crack. It sounded like something very heavy being dragged across rough gravel and undergrowth, slow and rhythmic, coming from deep within the forest. My rational mind immediately jumped to animal? Poacher? I switched off the lights in the shack and pressed my face against the dusty window. All I could see was the inky black silhouette of the tree line against a sliver of moonlight. The dragging sound stopped the moment I focused on it. I grabbed my flashlight, a sturdy, heavy-duty mag light, and stepped out. The air felt colder, heavier. I pointed the beam toward the woods, tracing the fence line. Nothing, just twisted trees that looked like reaching claws. The moment I started walking back to the shack, the dragging sound resumed, now closer. I retreated to the safety of the shack, my heart pounding a new rhythm against my ribs. In the morning, when my colleague arrived, I asked him about strange animals. He just grinned uncomfortably and said, "Don't worry about the animals, Tom. Worry about the things that walk on 2 legs." The strange occurrences became routine. The dragging, the low, guttural thumping, and sometimes a quiet, almost imperceptible whispering, not like one voice, but like a dozen, muffled by distance and leaves. I started doing my security rounds much faster, always feeling a profound sense of being observed. Then, about a week after the first incident, I saw it. It was 3 a.m., total darkness save for a weak sliver of moon. I was checking the back perimeter of the warehouse, which was the furthest point from my safe haven. As I turned to walk back, I froze. By the chain-link fence, less than 20 feet away, where the dark undergrowth met the metal, stood a silhouette. It was tall. That was the first terrifying thought. Not just tall like a man, but unnaturally elongated and slender. I couldn't bring myself to shine the beam of the maglight directly onto it. I just stared at the silhouette, which was an unnatural shade of blacker than black against the shadows around it. It was completely motionless. And then I noticed the movement. The entire figure remained still, but its head, or whatever passed for one, tilted slowly to the side like a curious bird. Only it was analyzing me with a chilling, cold interest. My body refused to move. The adrenaline had locked me in place. And then, from that spot near the fence, I heard something that truly shattered my composure. It wasn't the whispering. It was a loud, deep, cracking sigh, almost human-sounding but with a strange, rough resonance, as if the sound was created by a throat that hadn't been used to speak in a very long time. It was as if the thing was acknowledging my presence, simply saying, There you are. I ran. I sprinted back to the guard shack, slammed the door, locked it, and pulled the window blinds down. I was shaking so violently I couldn't hold my flashlight steady. I didn't bother calling the police. I knew what they'd say. I spent the rest of the shift until 6 a.m. huddled by the door, hand on the handle, trying to breathe quietly. The dragging and the silence were gone. They were replaced by a slow, repetitive, quiet tapping on the fence right outside my window. A gentle tap, 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 like the tip of a single fingernail. The moment my relief arrived, I bolted. I didn't say goodbye, I just collected my things and drove away. I quit that very morning. I still don't know what I saw. A very tall person? An animal on its hind legs? Or something else entirely? But here's the most disturbing part. Months later, checking local news online, I stumbled upon a small report. In the Black Forest, near the industrial zone, a discarded tent and personal effects belonging to a missing hiker from over a year ago were found. The body was never located. I know whatever is in that forest is active, and it waits. I've had my share of truly terrible jobs, but nothing compared to the 4 months I spent as a closing manager at a chain toy store. Let's call it Toys Plus. The store was massive, 2 full floors of brightly colored plastic and licensed merchandise. But by 11 p.m., when the last customer left and the cleaning crew finished, the atmosphere transformed. It became a cavernous, dark tomb filled with thousands of plastic eyes staring out of the darkness. My main job was simple: lock up the cash registers, finish the daily paperwork, and ensure the entire building was secure before setting the alarm and leaving around 1 a.m. The building itself was old, built in the late 70s, and it came with all the quirks of aging commercial architecture. Constant draft, random creaks, and an elevator that sounded like it was crying when it moved. But there was one section that always gave me the chills: the doll and action figure aisle on the 2nd floor. It was right next to the emergency exit stairs, a place rarely used, and the low lighting there seemed to just swallow sound. The first few weeks were fine. Routine was everything. But one Tuesday night, as I was reconciling the final receipts downstairs, I heard it. A sound, clear as a bell, coming from the 2nd floor. Laughter. It was a light, high-pitched giggle. Not loud, but definitely there and definitely human. I immediately thought, a kid must have hidden after closing. It happens. Kids sometimes hide in the giant cardboard display boxes as a dare. I grabbed my flashlight and jogged upstairs, flipping on the main lights as I went. The 2nd floor was empty. The sound system was off and no windows were open. I walked through every aisle, checking the large boxes and behind the seasonal displays. Nothing. I assumed it must have been the building settling, or maybe fatigue playing tricks on me. I went back downstairs, started my computer for the final shutdown, and dismissed it. 5 minutes later, the laughter returned. Only this time, it was much closer, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of a single, slow clack, like a small, hard object hitting the tiled floor. Now I was truly unnerved. I went back upstairs, much slower this time. I walked to the dolls and action figures aisle where the sound seemed to have originated. I stopped and held my breath, listening for any shift in the air. That's when I saw it. On the floor, right in front of the emergency exit door, was a doll. It was one of the large, expensive porcelain collectible dolls taken out of its display case. I knew which one it was. It was positioned high up on a shelf behind a protective acrylic sheet. Now it was lying face up on the cold tile, its glass eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. It hadn't just fallen. Someone, or something, had taken it out of its locked display. My blood ran cold. I immediately called my district manager, Jim, and told him I thought we had an intruder. He told me to lock myself in the office and call the police. I did exactly that. I ran downstairs, slammed the heavy metal door of the manager's office shut, and keyed in the number for emergency services. While I was on the line with the dispatcher, whispering the address and trying to keep my voice from shaking, I started hearing a series of small, rapid taps coming from the outside of the office door. It sounded like the person, or whatever it was just on the other side. I lowered the phone and froze. The tapping stopped. Then, from the hallway outside the office, I heard a sound that didn't make any sense. The noise of a small music box winding down. It was one of the toys from the baby section, a little elephant that played a gentle lullaby. The song was slow, sweet, and utterly terrifying in the dead silence of the sealed store. The lullaby faded out. Silence. Then the tapping started again, but this time it wasn't just on the door. It was on the observation window set high up in the door. I knew I couldn't look. I couldn't confirm that there was a face pressing against the glass. I huddled under the desk, trying to keep the dispatcher updated through choked whispers. I waited maybe 10 minutes, which felt like an eternity, until I heard the distant sirens and the heavy metallic clang of the police kicking open the main emergency entrance. They searched the entire building, every aisle, every box, every bathroom stall. They found nothing. All doors and windows were still locked and intact. The only thing they found was the porcelain doll on the second floor and the music box lying on the hallway floor right outside my office, an item that was usually kept locked in a storage closet. The police determined that the building was secure and that I was likely suffering from stress and fatigue. I knew better. I quit the next day. But before I left, I went back upstairs to retrieve my personal lockbox. As I was walking through the empty aisles for the last time, I glanced at the display where the porcelain doll usually sat. I stopped dead. The protective acrylic sheet for the doll was back in place, but someone, or something, had replaced the doll on the stand. It wasn't the original doll. It was a cheap, plastic action figure of a small, smiling man. And someone had positioned it so it was facing outwards, its plastic head slightly tilted, looking directly down the aisle toward the office where I had hidden. I didn't touch it. I just walked out and never looked back. To this day, I can still hear that high-pitched giggle and the tune of that music box whenever I'm left alone in the dark. The scariest things that ever happen often occur when you're tired, isolated, and far from help. And that perfectly describes the drive I had to make every other month for work. I used to be a regional sales rep, and my territory meant driving between two major cities, a 6-hour route that mostly involved empty, winding back roads through a heavily forested state park. I usually drove it at night to beat the traffic, meaning I was alone on the highway between midnight and 3 a.m. It was one of those foggy, moonless nights in late October, the kind of night where your headlights just seem to illuminate a shallow, gray bowl in front of your car, and everything else is just thick darkness. I was about halfway through the route, running on stale coffee and pure stubbornness, when I saw him. He was standing right next to the white line on the shoulder, facing away from me, his thumb stuck out vaguely towards the road. He was tall, dressed in dark, heavy clothing, and he carried a bulky, old-fashioned rucksack. The unusual thing was his location. This wasn't near any town or gas station. It was a completely desolate stretch of highway surrounded by woods on both sides. I'm generally cautious about picking up strangers, but the guy looked genuinely distressed. Maybe his car broke down. I pulled over about 50 feet past him, waited until he was close, and popped the trunk release. He didn't walk towards the trunk. He walked straight to the passenger door and pulled it open without waiting. He slid into the seat, dropping his huge rucksack onto the floor, which landed with a muffled clank, like something hard and metallic hitting the carpet. "Thanks," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. His tone wasn't grateful, though. It was just flat. I glanced over. He had a strong, unsettling presence. His eyes were dark and intense. He never looked at me, he just stared straight ahead through the windshield, even though the fog made seeing more than 20 feet impossible. "Where are you heading?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. "Just north," he said. "North is a long way," I chuckled nervously. "I'm going to the town of Willow Creek. That's about 2 hours from here." "That'll do," he replied. And that was it. The conversation ended. The silence that followed was heavy and unnerving. I tried to make small talk, asked about his rucksack, asked what he was doing out here, asked if he was a hiker. Every answer was a one-word grunt or a short, uninformative phrase. I started to feel a deep, chilling regret. About 40 minutes into the drive, I started to notice his movements. He wasn't sitting still. He was subtly moving his right hand, reaching down, unzipping his rucksack, and reaching inside. I shot a quick glance at him. He was definitely fumbling with something heavy and dense inside that bag. My mind instantly spiraled into horror movie cliches. Is he pulling out a weapon? A knife? I started calculating the distance to the next potential landmark, a closed gas station maybe 15 minutes away. I sped up and gripped the wheel tighter. Then he stopped fumbling. He slowly, deliberately pulled his hand out of the bag. And he wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, very old, and very rusty metal box. It looked like something you'd find buried in the dirt. He placed the box on his lap and slowly, inch by inch, started to slide the lid open. He was completely focused on the box. His face was unreadable. I was terrified, but also morbidly curious. What could be so important inside that rusty box? As the lid finally started to separate from the base, I caught a tiny movement in the corner of my eye. He wasn't looking at the box anymore. He had turned his head slowly, and now his intense, dark eyes were fixed entirely on me, holding my gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. And then he did something that still makes my stomach turn. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly or reassuring smile. It was a wide, unnatural grin that looked completely foreign on his face, like a mask pulled too tight. His eyes, fixed on mine, didn't move. In a voice that was suddenly clear and eerily cheerful, he said, "Do you want to see what's in the box, friend? It's something I found. Something important." The casual tone, the sudden friendliness, and that smile, it was all wrong. I didn't want to know what was in the box. I didn't want to be friends. I jammed my foot down on the accelerator and changed the subject instantly. "Listen, I need to stop here for gas," I lied, even though the tank was full. I pulled the car violently onto the gravel parking lot of a closed-down truck stop. Before the car had fully stopped, I unlocked the doors. "This is as far as I go tonight. I have to call in an urgent issue. I wish you the best of luck." He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just kept that wide, unsettling smile on his face, holding the rusty box loosely in his hands. "Are you sure?" he asked. The cheerfulness was still there, but now there was a thin, cold edge of warning underneath it. "I was enjoying the ride." "Yes," I insisted, forcing the words out. "I have to stop now. You need to get out." He stared at me for maybe 3 more seconds, then his expression snapped back to the blank, heavy presence he had been before. Without another word, he opened the door, retrieved his heavy rucksack with that metallic clank, and closed the door. I sat there, frozen, watching him walk away. He didn't walk towards the road to catch the next car. He walked straight across the abandoned parking lot and disappeared into the thick fog and the woods behind the truck stop. The moment he was gone, I slammed the lock buttons and tore out of that parking lot, driving faster than I've ever driven in my life. I didn't slow down until I hit the city limits. I never picked up a hitchhiker again. And I still don't know what was in that box, or what kind of person or thing gets dropped off in the middle of nowhere only to walk straight into the deep woods. But every time I drive that route, I remember that smile, and I remember how close I was to seeing the contents of that box. And I'm infinitely grateful I never did. It happened 2 years ago, on Christmas Eve. I was driving home from my night shift at the hospital, exhausted, snow tapping on the windshield like impatient fingers. I lived 30 minutes away in a quiet mountain town, where the roads get dangerously empty after dark. Around 2 a.m., I turned onto Pine Ridge Road, a long, winding forest path completely swallowed by snow. I remember yawning, rubbing my eyes, and then seeing her. A little girl standing alone on the side of the road. Red winter coat, no hat, no gloves, snow piling on her shoulders. I slammed the brakes so hard my seatbelt punched into my chest. I rolled down the window, heart hammering. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She looked up slowly. Her cheeks were blue from cold. Her eyes were wrong, too wide, too motionless. Then she whispered, "Please, don't leave me alone again." My stomach dropped. Again? I jumped out, opened the back door, and helped her inside. She didn't resist, she didn't speak, just stared straight ahead. As I got back in the driver's seat, I saw something in the rearview mirror. Her breath, it didn't fog the window. Mine did, hers didn't. I told myself it was just shock, hypothermia, something explainable. I turned the heat up full blast. "Where do you live?" I asked. She slowly lifted a shaking hand and pointed down the road. So I began driving. Her voice finally broke the silence. "You're not supposed to be here tonight." "What do you mean?" Silence. Then she mumbled something like she was quoting someone. "He waits in the trees for the ones who stop." I felt every hair on my arms rise. Who waits in the trees? She didn't answer. Instead, she suddenly sat up straight and shouted, "Turn here!" I swerved into a narrow driveway leading to a dark cabin half buried in snow. No lights, no signs of life. I put the car in park. She unbuckled herself, opened the door, and stepped outside like she knew exactly where she was. I followed. The cabin door was slightly open. Wind moaned through the gap like someone crying. The girl walked in without hesitation. "Wait, don't go alone," I called. Inside was pitch black. I pulled out my phone for light. The place was freezing. Frost crawled across the windows like veins. There were family photos on the walls, dusty, old, untouched for years. And then I saw her, the same girl, in one of the photos, smiling, alive, normal. The date below it read December 24th, 1997, 25 years ago. Footsteps creaked behind me. I turned. The girl was standing inches from my face, her eyes now hollow. She whispered, "You brought him with you." A loud thud hit the outside wall, then another, something heavy dragging along the siding. I killed my phone flashlight. My breath echoed in the silence, but hers, still nothing. She pointed toward the window. I reluctantly looked. Something tall stood outside, a silhouette, impossibly long arms, head tilted at an unnatural angle, just standing there, watching the cabin. The girl grabbed my wrist with ice-cold fingers. "He follows cars on this road," she whispered. "He looks for people who stop." My heart slammed in my chest. What does he want? Her face twisted in pain. New ones. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. No service. The thuds grew louder, faster, scratching across the wooden boards. He was circling us. I whispered, "What happened to you?" She lowered her head. "My parents' car broke down here. They left to find help, and he found me first. He keeps the ones who freeze. She looked up. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to follow me home. My blood froze. You wanted me to come here? She nodded. So I could warn you. Then she pointed at the front door, her face suddenly terrified. He's coming in, right now. Run! I didn't wait. I sprinted out the back door, snow blinding my eyes. My car was parked at the edge of the trees. Behind me, a wet, rattling inhale. Not human. I didn't dare look. I threw myself into the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine whined. "Come on!" I screamed. He stepped out of the tree line, tall, thin, face pale and stretched like wet paper. My engine roared to life. I slammed the gas and sped down the driveway, but in the mirror, the girl was standing at the cabin door, smiling softly. She mouthed, "Thank you." And then she was gone, like she had never been there at all. I reported everything to the police. They searched the cabin. They found the remains of a family frozen inside, parents and one child, identified as missing since 1997. But officers said something that made my blood run cold. No footsteps in the snow except yours. No child's footprints, no man's, no one else at all. I still drive that road sometimes, not on purpose, life just leads me there. And every Christmas Eve, I see tiny red flakes of fabric in the snow, a torn piece of a coat. They weren't there the day before. They're never there the day after. Just the night he waits in the trees for the ones who stop. Every Christmas, I go down a rabbit hole of old police cold cases, strange disappearances, unsolved scenes, things people forgot. Last year, I found one that changed everything. The title of the folder was Snowman Incident, December 24, 1998. There were only a few photos, some transcripts, and one handwritten note at the bottom. Nobody must know it wasn't a person. But there was no body in the photos, no blood, no sign of struggle, just a snowman standing alone in the middle of the family's yard. Not a cute one either. Its stick arms were too long, bent unnaturally, and its smile was carved far too wide. Its eyes weren't pieces of coal, they were hollow. Two burned-out holes staring into nothing. The next photo made my skin tighten. Footprints, a full set, mother, father, daughter, leading from the house toward the snowman, but none returning, like the family walked up to it and simply stopped existing. There was a transcript attached. The only surviving witness was their 10-year-old son. Most of it was redacted except for one chilling line. The snowman had something moving inside it. That was the moment I made the worst decision of my life. The house from the case no longer existed, but the location matched an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the woods. So I did something stupid. I decided to spend Christmas Eve alone in that cabin, just to see if the story was real, or at least understand it. The first night was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no animals, just the sound of snow settling. But the second night, everything changed. It happened around 3 a.m., a soft, rhythmic crunch in the snow outside. I peeked through the curtain and froze. Something stood outside, perfectly still. A shape. A snowman. Not built by me, not there the night before. 3 snowballs stacked on top of each other, but its head was smooth, blank, no eyes, no mouth. Yet I felt it watching me. The air inside the cabin got heavier. My breath fogged the window. I backed away and locked the door. Then came the sound that still haunts me, a slow, dragging step. Then another and another. Something outside was walking toward the cabin. Snow doesn't walk, snow doesn't breathe, but whatever stood outside did. It leaned against the door, and I heard it. A wet, muffled, choking breath, like someone drowning in snow. I don't remember how long I sat there, paralyzed. When I finally looked again, the snowman was gone. But around the cabin, in a perfect circle, were tracks. Pacing, watching, exactly like the old crime scene photos. That was my breaking point. I grabbed my bag, ripped open the door, and froze mid-step. Someone had left the snowman's head on my doorstep. Smooth, hollow, like an empty skull made of snow. I ran through the forest, through the darkness, and then I heard it. Not behind me, around me, moving between the trees. A soft, unnatural crunch, 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 lighter than human steps, but deliberate. I turned, and I saw it. The snowman was walking, not rolling, not sliding, walking. Its long, stick arms dragged against the ground. Its chest bulged like something inside was trying to press through the snow. Something living. I ran until my lungs burned. Eventually, hunters found me on the roadside, half frozen, incoherent. Police searched the cabin the next day. They found nothing. No tracks, no snowman, just a few broken branches and a single lump of coal. I tried to convince myself I imagined everything. Until this year. 2 days ago, I took the trash out behind my house, and there it stood, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, a snowman. The same shape, the same blank face, the same burned-out holes for eyes, and beneath it, a trail of small footprints in the snow. Not human, not animal, footprints of something that lives inside the snow. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow fell like powdered glass across the silent town. The streets were empty, the lights on the houses flickering in the bitter wind. I hadn't planned to visit the old post office, not tonight, but something inside me pushed me there. I stepped inside. Dust hung in the corners, motes floating in the weak light. The scent of aged paper and something else, something coppery, filled the air. On the counter, there was a single envelope, no return address, no stamp, just my name written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Do not open until midnight. I swallowed hard. My heart thumped. And, of course, curiosity won. I tore it open. Inside, a short letter. I've been watching your family. They are not safe. Meet me at the church by the old cemetery. Midnight. I dropped the letter. A chill ran down my spine. The church, the cemetery, at midnight. I should have laughed, told myself it was a joke, but something told me this was serious. The snow was deeper now. My breath formed clouds in the cold air. The roads twisted like frozen ribbons through the forest. I drove, mind racing, eyes darting to every shadow. Halfway there, my phone buzzed. No notifications, no calls, just a single text. You're being watched. Don't stop. I slammed the accelerator. Branches scraped against the car. The headlights cut through the white, but I felt eyes. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, but then I saw them. Tiny footprints in the snow leading from the trees to the road. Too small to be human, and yet perfectly spaced. Deliberate. They know you're coming. I shivered. Every instinct screamed to turn back. I didn't. The church loomed like a shadow, black and silent. Its windows were frosted, the doors slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The pews were empty. The air smelled of damp wood and burning candles, though no flames burned. At the altar, a single figure knelt, tall, cloaked, head bowed. I froze. Then it looked up. No face, just a smooth, pale void. It raised one hand, slowly. A box appeared on the floor before me, wrapped in brown paper, tied with a red ribbon. A note atop it. Open it, or they die. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed not to touch it. But I didn't know who they were. Family? Friends? The strangers from the letter? I untied the ribbon. The paper fell away. Inside, a collection of miniature dolls. Each one looked exactly like a member of my family. Faces painted in exquisite, horrifying detail. Eyes open, staring. One wrong move, one moment too late, they'll join you. A sudden gust of wind slammed the church doors shut. The candles ignited. Flickering shadows danced along the walls. The cloaked figure was gone. Then a whisper from every corner. You can't leave. Not until the game is done. The dolls, they began to move. Tiny, jerky motions crawling across the floor. Each step, each turn mirrored a real movement from earlier that day. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. I backed into the pews. A door slammed, another opened. I realized the church was changing. Corridors stretching impossibly, doors leading nowhere, walls shifting. A small voice, childlike, from the doll nearest me. It's time to play. I ran, trying to escape the shifting church. Every step echoed unnaturally. The dolls followed, always in my peripheral vision. Each seemed to mimic a family member's movement, their expressions twisted in silent screams. A voice boomed, though no lips moved. Pick one. Choose wisely. I spun around. 3 doors appeared. Behind each, a glowing silhouette, waiting. My mind raced. I had to make a choice. I opened the first door. Inside, nothing. Just snow falling in slow motion. Relief? No, because the voice whispered, try again. Second door. Inside, the dolls now standing in a circle, chanting. I slammed it shut. Third door. I stepped through. I emerged. Not outside, not anywhere I recognized. The room was warm, bright, decorated for Christmas. And there, seated at the table, my family, laughing. I ran to them, hugged them. Relief flooded me. Then I noticed. Their faces. Wrong. The eyes too glossy, the smiles too still. I looked down at my hands. They've been replaced. The dolls? Gone. But a note burned into the table. Merry Christmas. See you next year. The church doors slammed behind me. I turned to run. The hall stretched endlessly, and in the distance, the faint sound of tiny footsteps and laughter. The night was unusually still at Blackwood Ridge. It was the kind of place local teenagers went to escape the prying eyes of their parents. A long, winding dirt road that ended at a cliff overlooking the sleeping town of Oak Haven. Mark and Sarah sat in Mark's old 1967 Chevy, the engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp night air. Outside, the forest was a wall of impenetrable shadows, with the moon providing only a ghostly, pale silver light that barely touched the ground. Inside the car, the world felt small and safe. The radio was playing a slow, fuzzy jazz station from the city, the static crackling like a dying fire. Sarah leaned her head against the window, watching the fog from her breath bloom and fade on the cold glass. She felt a strange unease, a prickle on the back of her neck that she couldn't explain. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the radio. Mark chuckled, though he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Hear what? It's just the wind, Sarah, or maybe a deer in the brush. Relax." But Sarah couldn't relax. The silence of the woods felt heavy, like it was pressing against the car doors, waiting for a crack to get in. The music on the radio suddenly cut out. For a moment, there was only the hum of empty air and then a frantic news bulletin broke through. The announcer's voice was high-pitched, strained, with a sense of urgency that shattered the romantic atmosphere instantly. "We interrupt this program with an emergency bulletin from the state penitentiary. Convicted murderer Thomas the Butcher Vane has escaped the psychiatric ward. Vane is considered extremely dangerous. He is described as 6 feet tall, wearing a tattered gray jumpsuit. Please note, Vane is missing his right hand, which has been replaced by a sharpened steel hook. All residents in the Blackwood County area are advised to lock their doors and remain indoors until further notice." The radio clicked back to music, but the jazz now sounded discordant and mocking. Sarah's face went white. She reached for the door lock, clicking it down with a sharp snap. "Mark, we have to go. Now," she said, her eyes darting to the side mirror. Mark groaned, though his face showed a flicker of fear he tried to hide with bravado. "Sarah, come on. That prison is 40 miles away. The chances of him being exactly here at this exact moment are 0. It's a big world out there." "I don't care about the chances," Sarah hissed. "I want to leave. I feel like someone is watching us." Mark sighed, reaching for the ignition, but before he could turn the key, the car rocked gently. It wasn't the wind. It felt like something heavy had leaned against the rear bumper. Then it started. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A sound like a dry branch dragging across a window, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. It started at the back of the car and slowly moved along the passenger side, the sound of metal being scored by something harder than steel. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, shrinking toward the center of the car. "Did you hear that? Something is out there!" Mark grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and shone it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the thick trunks of the oak trees, but there was nothing there. Just the swirling mist and the deep, black shadows. "There's nothing there, Sarah. It's probably just a branch caught in the wheel well." "Branches don't move like that, Mark. Please, just start the car." Mark, now angry and shaken himself, turned the key. The engine roared to life, a violent intrusion into the quiet of the ridge. He slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt, throwing gravel against the undercarriage. He didn't look back. He shifted into drive and floored it, the Chevy fishtailing as he tore down the winding dirt road toward the safety of the highway lights. The drive back to Sarah's house was silent. Mark drove 10 miles over the speed limit, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was frustrated with the ruined night, frustrated with Sarah's panic, and frustrated with the nagging fear that he couldn't quite shake off. Sarah sat huddled against the door, staring straight ahead. She didn't look at the woods as they passed. She didn't look at the mirrors. She just waited for the familiar glow of her street lamps. When they finally pulled into her driveway, the porch light of her house felt like the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Mark killed the engine. The silence returned, but this time it was the safe silence of the suburbs. "Look," Mark said, his voice softer now. "I'm sorry I got snappy. It was just a scare. We're safe, see? No monsters, no hooks, just us." Sarah nodded, though her heart was still thumping against her ribs. "I know. I'm sorry I panicked. I'll see you tomorrow?" "Yeah," Mark said, reaching over to pat her hand. "I'll come around to open the door for you." Mark stepped out of the car. He walked around the front of the Chevy, the headlights still cooling with a faint metallic pinging sound. He reached for the handle of the passenger door to let Sarah out, but he stopped. His hand froze inches from the chrome handle. His jaw dropped, and a sound of pure, unadulterated horror escaped his throat, a strangled gasp that made Sarah's heart freeze. "Mark, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stepped back, pointing at the door handle with a shaking finger. Sarah leaned over and looked through the glass. There, hanging from the chrome handle of the passenger door, was a jagged, blood-stained steel hook. It was buried deep into the metal of the door, as if it had been ripped violently from a man's arm when the car had suddenly sped away. Small droplets of something dark and thick were still dripping from the tip of the hook onto the driveway. Sarah didn't scream. She couldn't. She simply looked up at the dark woods in the distance, knowing that somewhere back on Blackwood Ridge, a man with only one hand was standing in the road, watching the taillights disappear and waiting for the next car to arrive. The night was heavy, draped in a thick, suffocating blanket of rain that turned the world outside into a blurred mosaic of gray and black. It was the kind of night where the wind doesn't just blow, it moans, searching for cracks in the windows, whispering secrets to anyone brave enough to listen. Clara sat on a plush, velvet sofa in the center of a living room that felt too large for one person. This was the Miller estate, a glass and steel monument to wealth isolated on a hill miles away from the nearest neighbor. She was 19, a student who needed the money, and this job seemed like a gift. All she had to do was watch over 2 sleeping children for a few hours while the parents attended a gala in the city. At 8 o'clock, the Millers had disappeared into the rain in their silver sedan, leaving Clara with a list of emergency numbers and a silence so profound it made her ears ring. For the first hour, Clara tried to study, but the house wouldn't let her. Every house has its own language of creaks and settles, but this one sounded different. It sounded like it was breathing. The grandfather clock in the foyer marked the seconds with a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the hallways. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each sound felt like a hammer hitting a nail. It was 9:45 p.m. when the first vibration broke the rhythm of the clock. Clara's phone slid an inch across the glass coffee table. The screen glowed a ghostly white, illuminating the dark corners of the room. Private number. She answered with a polite, practiced voice. "Hello, Miller residence?" There was no reply, at least not a vocal one. All Clara could hear was the sound of air moving, a heavy, rhythmic breathing as if someone had just finished running a marathon and was now standing right behind her. "Hello?" she repeated, her voice smaller this time. "Mr. Miller, is that you?" A voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't Mr. Miller. It was a raspy, sandpaper-dry whisper that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "Have you checked the children?" The line went dead. Clara stared at the black screen of her phone. Her heart gave a sharp, painful tug in her chest. A prank call. It had to be a prank. Someone from her university probably knew she was babysitting out here in the middle of nowhere and wanted to scare the city girl. She forced a laugh, but it died in her throat. She looked toward the grand staircase. The second floor was a cavern of shadows. The lights were off to keep the children asleep, and the darkness up there felt thick, almost liquid. She didn't go up, not yet. Instead, she walked around the ground floor, checking the locks. Front door, bolted. Side door, locked. Large French doors leading to the patio, secured. As she moved through the house, she turned on every light she could find. The mansion began to glow like a lighthouse in the storm, but instead of feeling safer, Clara felt exposed, like a bird in a glass cage, visible to anything lurking in the woods outside. She returned to the sofa, pulling her knees up to her chest. She tried to focus on her textbook, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. Then, the phone vibrated again. Her heart skipped a beat. Her thumb hovered over the accept button. She wanted to ignore it, but the fear of not knowing was worse than the fear of answering. "Listen," she snapped into the receiver, her voice trembling. "I've already traced this. If you call again, the police will be at your door in 5 minutes. Leave me alone." The laughter that came back was low and hollow. "The police? They won't make it in time, Clara." Her blood turned to ice. He knew her name. "Why haven't you gone upstairs?" the voice whispered. "They look so peaceful when they aren't screaming. Why don't you go up and see for yourself?" Clara's breath hitched. Her lungs felt like they were filled with lead. Without hanging up on the stranger, she used the house's landline to call the emergency operator. Her voice was a jagged whisper as she explained the situation. "Stay on the line," the operator commanded, her voice a steady anchor in Clara's sea of panic. "I am tracing the source of the incoming calls to your cell phone. Just keep him talking if he calls back. Are the doors locked?" "Yes," Clara whimpered, clutching the receiver so hard her knuckles turned white. "Everything is locked. I'm alone. I'm all alone." Suddenly, the house's silence was shattered. Upstairs, directly above her head, came a dull, heavy thud. It was followed by the sound of something wet being dragged across the hardwood floor. The phone in her hand vibrated again. The stranger was calling back. "Clara." The operator's voice suddenly turned sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "Clara, listen to me very carefully. We have traced the calls. They aren't coming from outside. They are coming from the secondary landline in the master bedroom." Clara's heart stopped. "What? No, that's upstairs." "Get out of the house," the operator screamed. "The intruder is in the house with you. He is upstairs. Get out now." Clara didn't scream. She couldn't. Her body acted on pure, primal instinct. She bolted toward the front door, her socks sliding on the polished floor. As she reached for the deadbolt, she made the mistake of looking back. At the top of the grand staircase, a door creaked open. A sliver of light from the hallway illuminated a tall, shadow-drenched figure standing on the landing. In one hand, he held a phone. In the other, something long and metallic that glinted in the dim light. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was obscured by a darkness that seemed to move on its own. He didn't run. He simply stepped onto the first stair, his eyes locked onto hers. Clara ripped the front door open and dove into the freezing rain, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. She ran until her chest burned, until she saw the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers tearing up the driveway. When the police searched the house, they found the children, unharmed but deeply asleep, drugged with a sedative. In the master bedroom upstairs, the window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the storm. On the nightstand lay a butcher knife and the house phone. But it was what they found on the floor that haunted Clara for the rest of her life. Next to the children's beds were two small, hand-carved wooden dolls that hadn't been there before. And written in lipstick on the hallway mirror were 5 words: "Thank you for watching them." In June of 1972, a woman appeared in the emergency room of Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. To see someone in a blood-soaked white gown in an ER is not unusual, but there were 2 things that caused the witnesses to vomit or faint in pure terror. First, she wasn't exactly human. She resembled something closer to a mannequin, but with the fluidity and grace of a living creature. Her face was as smooth as polished porcelain. No eyebrows, no pores, no blemishes. Her features were perfectly symmetrical, but frozen. She had a face, but she had no expression. Second, she had a kitten clamped between her teeth. Its blood ran down her white dress and onto the sterile linoleum floor. She didn't swallow, she didn't chew. She simply stood there, staring into nothingness with vacant, glassy eyes. The medical staff, though paralyzed by an instinctive, primal fear, managed to lead her to a private room. She offered no resistance. She was as limp as a doll. As they cleaned the blood from her face, they realized she wasn't wearing a mask. That soulless, plastic-like surface was her skin. She remained silent and motionless for hours. The doctors decided that sedating her was the best course of action until the authorities could arrive. They moved her to an operating table. Throughout the entire process, she didn't blink once. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling lights, reflecting the fluorescent glow like 2 dark mirrors. Dr. Aristome, the lead surgeon on duty, approached her with a syringe. He was a veteran of the ER, a man who had seen the worst horrors humanity could inflict, but his hands were shaking. As he leaned over her, she finally moved. She didn't struggle, she didn't scream. She simply turned her head toward him and did something that would haunt the staff for the rest of their lives. She smiled. As her lips parted, the doctors gasped. Her mouth was not filled with human teeth. Instead, it was packed with long, needle-sharp spikes of bone, too many of them to fit in a human jaw. They were serrated and glinted like chrome under the surgical lights. Dr. Aristome stepped back, the syringe falling from his nerveless fingers. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. The woman didn't answer with words. She leaned forward, her neck stretching at an impossible angle, and whispered directly into his ear. Her voice wasn't a voice at all. It was the sound of static and grinding metal. "I am God." In a flash of movement, too fast for the human eye to follow, she lunged. The sound of tearing flesh and breaking bone filled the small room. The security guards outside heard a single, strangled cry before the heavy doors swung open. The woman stepped out into the hallway, her white dress now completely crimson. Dr. Aristome was found slumped against the operating table, his throat missing. The other nurses were found in corners of the room, their eyes wide with a shock that had stopped their hearts. The woman walked calmly toward the hospital exit. Every person she passed was paralyzed by her gaze, that blank, porcelain stare and that mouthful of needles. She vanished into the Los Angeles night and was never seen again. To this day, the staff who survived that night refuse to speak of her. They only refer to her as the expressionless. And some say that if you look too closely at the mannequins in a store window late at night, you might just see one of them blink. I've always preferred the swamps to the mountains. There's something honest about the muck. It doesn't pretend to be majestic, it just is. But after what happened last October at Blackwater Creek, I realized that some things stay in the muck for a reason. I was solo kayaking through a remote tributary of the Atchafalaya Basin. My plan was to camp on a hammock, a small patch of dry land rising out of the stagnant water. I found one just before sunset. It was a miserable little island with one dead cypress tree standing in the center like a gallows. The water in the creek was different that day. It wasn't brown, it was oil-slick black, and it didn't ripple. It looked like solid glass. As I set up my small hammock tent between the cypress and a sturdy tupelo, I noticed the silence. No bullfrogs, no cicadas, just the sound of my own breathing. I ate a cold meal, wanting to avoid a fire that would attract the swarms of mosquitoes I expected. But the mosquitoes never came. Even the insects seemed to be avoiding that island. I climbed into my hammock, suspended 5 feet above the black water, and drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up at midnight to the sound of something breaking the surface. Plop, plop. It sounded like large stones being dropped into the water, one by one, in a perfect circle around my camp. I turned on my headlamp and peered over the edge of my hammock. The light hit the water, but it didn't penetrate. It just reflected off that obsidian surface. The stones weren't stones at all. They were heads, dozens of them. They looked like human skulls, but they were covered in a thick, translucent film, like a layer of jellyfish slime. They were bobbing in the water, their empty eye sockets fixed on me. They weren't floating, they were rising out of the mud on long, leathery necks that looked like rotted kelp. I froze. I was suspended right above them. If I fell, I'd land in a nest of them. Then, the dead cypress tree behind me began to vibrate. I felt the hum through the ropes of my hammock. From the hollow of the tree, a hand emerged. It was huge, gray, and dripping with black slime. It didn't have fingers. It had 5 long, suckered tentacles that began to feel along the ropes, searching for the knot. It was untying me. I grabbed my machete from the side pocket. As the first rope gave way and my hammock tilted sharply toward the water, I swung. The machete bit into the gray limb and the thick, black fluid hissed out, smelling like a dead sea. The hand retracted with a sound like a wet lung collapsing. I tumbled out of the hammock, landing on the muddy edge of the island. The heads in the water began to move toward the shore. They didn't have bodies, just those long, pulsing necks connected to something massive beneath the surface. I lunged for my kayak. It was half filled with that same black slime. I didn't care. I pushed it into the water and jumped in, paddling with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. Every time my paddle dipped into the water, I felt it hit something soft and rubbery. The heads were under me now, bumping against the bottom of the thin plastic hull. Thump, thump, thump. A voice rose from the water. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like air bubbles bursting in mud. "Stay. It's so cold. Stay and be the skin." I didn't look back until I reached the main channel 3 hours later. My hands were blistered and my kayak was stained with that foul, black grease. When I finally reached the boat ramp and hauled my kayak onto the grass, I saw it. Stuck to the very back of the boat was a piece of skin. It was perfectly rectangular, about the size of a human back, and it was covered in my own tattoos I had on my shoulders. I checked my back in the rearview mirror. My skin was there, untouched. But when I touched the area where the tattoos were, I felt nothing. No sensation, no pain, just a cold, numb patch of gray, slimy flesh. I never went back to the basin. Sometimes at night when I'm in the shower, the water feels a little too heavy, and when I look at the drain, I see a single bubble of black slime rising up, whispering in a voice that sounds just like mine. "We're still wearing it. We're still wearing you." My brother used to say that in the mountains, it's not a bear or a fall from a cliff that kills you, it's your own imagination. After that night, I know he was wrong. Sometimes what you imagine is far more merciful than the reality. I had set out for the Blackwood National Forest. I just wanted 3 days of peace away from work, my phone, and people. I found a spot about 10 kilometers from the nearest trail, a small clearing by a dry creek bed surrounded by pines so thick that it felt like twilight even at noon. The first night was quiet, just the crackling of the fire and the sighing of the wind. But on the second night, everything changed. I was sitting by the dying embers, finishing my dinner, when I heard it. Snap. The sound of a heavy footstep on dry needles. It came from about 20 meters behind my tent. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. You hear noises in the woods all the time, but this had a rhythm. 2 steps, a pause, 2 more steps. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and out of place in that silence. No answer, just a silence that was far too deep. The crickets had stopped chirping. That's always a bad sign in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam sliced through the darkness, but I saw only trunks and their long, dancing shadows. Nothing more. I went to bed with a heavy feeling, my camping axe laid right next to my sleeping bag. I didn't fall asleep until dawn, but it wasn't for long. I was woken up by the sound of a zipper. It wasn't the zipper on my sleeping bag, it was the zipper of my tent. Someone, or something, was opening it from the outside, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. I heard that soft zzzt repeating at regular intervals. I held my breath. My heart was hammering so hard I was afraid whoever was out there could hear it through the tent wall. I watched the top of the entrance. The slider was slowly moving down. A gap opened and cold night air began to bleed into the tent. Then it stopped. The gap was about 10 centimeters wide. I expected a hand to reach in or to see an eye peering through, but nothing happened. After 5 minutes that felt like hours, I summoned my courage. I grabbed the axe, unzipped the rest of the way, and lunged outside with a roar meant to mask my own terror. There was no one there. The fire was nothing but a pile of gray ash. Moonlight hit the clearing, making everything look like a black and white film. I walked around the tent, not a single footprint. Then I looked at my backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree by the fire pit. It was open. All my belongings were neatly laid out on the ground. My clothes, my mess kit, my first aid kit, everything was arranged in perfect rows, as if done by someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder. But one thing was missing: my boots. I started to panic. My socks soaked through instantly from the dew. I looked around and saw them. They were standing about 5 meters from the fire, their toes pointed directly toward the dark forest. I walked over to them, but as I leaned down to pick them up, I noticed something on the tree trunk directly above them. A small, carved figure made of bark was nailed there. It looked like a human with unnaturally long arms, and tied to that figure was a lock of my own hair. The same lock that had been bothering my eyes the night before, which I thought I had just absent-mindedly pulled out myself. In that moment, I heard a laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It sounded like 2 dry branches grinding together, trying to mimic human amusement. It was coming from directly above me. I looked up into the canopy of the pines. About 10 meters up, I saw a figure. It was incredibly thin, almost as if it were fused with the trunk. It was wearing my t-shirt, the one from my backpack, and its hands were clutching my camera. The flash of the camera blinded me for a second. Click! I didn't waste another moment. I didn't take the tent, I didn't take the backpack. I just shoved my feet into my boots, grabbed my axe, and ran. I ran toward the car, ignoring the branches whipping my face and the stones twisting my ankles. Behind me, the whole time, I heard that snapping wood sound and that imitated laughter. Whatever it was, it didn't want to catch me. It wanted to hunt me. It wanted to see my fear. I reached the car at daybreak. My hands were shaking so hard it took 5 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I pulled off the forest road onto the asphalt, I looked in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing at the edge of the woods. It was wearing my t-shirt and holding my camera. It reached up and raised the camera with a distorted grin, as if taking one last photo of me. When I got home, I realized one more item was missing from my bag: my journal. The next day, I got a notification from my cloud storage. My camera had briefly connected to Wi-Fi before being destroyed. There was only one new photo. It was me, sleeping in the tent, taken through that 10-centimeter gap in the zipper. And right next to my head, just inches from my face, was a gray, elongated hand, gently stroking my hair. I've always been a solo hiker. There's a specific kind of clarity you find when it's just you and the trail. But after what happened at Dead Man's Pass, I can't even look at a mountain without feeling a cold, oily shiver run down my spine. I was scouting a new route in the northern Cascades. My goal was a high-altitude plateau known locally as the Whispering Cliffs. The name, I assumed, came from the wind whistling through the limestone caves. I arrived at the base of the cliffs just as the sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the world in violent oranges and deep, bruised purples. I pitched my tent on a flat ledge about 50 feet above the valley floor. It was a perfect spot, defensible, dry, and with a view that would make any photographer weep. But as the darkness set in, the whispering started. It wasn't the wind. Wind has a whistle, a howl, or a moan. This was a dry, frantic muttering. It sounded like 1,000 people talking in a low hum just out of earshot. I sat by my stove, trying to ignore it, focusing on the blue flame of the burner. Help him. No. Closer. Help him. I snapped my head toward the darkness. My flashlight beam hit the gray rock walls. Nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was auditory pareidolia, the brain trying to find patterns in random noise. I crawled into my sleeping bag and jammed earplugs into my ears. I woke up at 3 a.m., not because of a sound, but because of a sensation. My tent was moving. It wasn't shaking from the wind, it was being dragged. I sat up, my heart thundering. The earplugs were still in, but I could feel the vibration of the gravel under my floor. I grabbed my knife and slashed a small hole in the rear mesh to see what was behind me. In the dim starlight, I saw a dozen thin, pale shapes. They looked like humans, but their limbs were too long, their skin the color of wet limestone. They weren't using their hands to pull the tent. They were using their teeth, biting into the fabric and the guy lines, dragging me slowly toward the edge of the cliff. I didn't scream. I knew if I screamed, they would know I was awake. I reached for my bear spray, but it was gone. They had unzipped the outer vestibule and taken only my defense tools. One of the creatures put its face against the mesh. It had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where the sockets should be, and a mouth filled with needle-thin teeth. It began to whisper, and this time it was right against my ear. "Don't be afraid. We just want to see the view with you." The voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from the rock itself. I didn't wait. I didn't grab my boots. I lunged out of the front zip, tumbling onto the sharp rocks. The creatures hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and vanished into the crevices of the cliff with impossible speed. I looked at the edge. My tent was now only inches away from a 200-foot drop. I scrambled toward the descent path, my bare feet bleeding on the shale. But the whispers followed me. They weren't behind me anymore. They were in front of me. Every time I reached a switchback, I would see one of those pale things standing in the middle of the trail, miming the actions of a person, brushing its teeth with a bone or pretending to read a map made of dried skin. They weren't trying to kill me. Not yet. They were playing with me. They were waiting for me to get tired. I spent the next 4 hours descending in a fever dream of terror. I fell, I crawled, and I felt their cold, wet fingers brush against my ankles every time I slowed down. They whispered my name. They whispered my mother's name. They knew things they couldn't possibly know. I reached my truck at the trailhead just as the first gray light of dawn broke. I didn't even look back. I drove until I hit a town with a 24-hour diner. I sat there, shivering in a booth, covered in blood and dirt. The waitress brought me coffee and looked at me with pity. "Rough night in the woods, honey?" I nodded, unable to speak. I reached into my pocket to find a coin for a payphone, but my fingers touched something cold and sharp. I pulled it out. It was a tooth. A long, needle-thin tooth wrapped in a small scrap of my tent's fabric. And then, from the air vent above my booth, I heard it, a faint, dry muttering. "Found you, found you, found you." I was a broke grad student looking for a place to stay for my final semester in Chicago. When I found the listing for a secluded attic suite in a historic Victorian house for $500 a month, I didn't ask questions. I should have. The landlord was a man named Mr. Henderson, a retired clockmaker who spoke in a voice so soft I had to lean in to hear him. He had one rule. The attic is yours, but the crawl space behind the wardrobe is for my storage. Do not disturb the clocks. The room was beautiful in a dusty, forgotten way. Clocks of all shapes and sizes lined the walls. Cuckoo clocks, grandfathers, tiny pocket watches. They all ticked in a chaotic, unsynchronized rhythm that eventually became a sort of white noise. The first week was fine, but on the 8th night, I woke up to a sound that wasn't ticking. It was a wet, sliding noise coming from behind the massive oak wardrobe that blocked the small door to the crawl space. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy bag of meat across the floorboards. I sat up, my heart hammering. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out. The noise stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I told myself it was just raccoons or the house settling. It's an old building, it's bound to have secrets. The next morning, I noticed something off. My toothbrush was damp. I hadn't used it yet, and the chair I'd left by my desk had been moved exactly 2 inches to the left. I know because it was no longer aligned with the scratch in the floor. I decided to buy a small, discreet security camera, the kind disguised as a USB charger. I plugged it in facing the wardrobe and went to the library to study. I came back around 10 p.m. Mr. Henderson was in the hallway polishing a brass pendulum. He didn't look up as I passed, but he whispered, "The clocks are restless today, Julian. You should sleep deeply." I went up, locked my door, and immediately opened my laptop to check the footage. My hands were cold as I scrolled through the hours of empty room. Then, at 2:14 p.m., the wardrobe moved. Not much, just enough for a gap to appear. A face emerged from the darkness of the crawl space. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. It was a younger man, incredibly thin, with skin the color of old parchment. He crawled out with a terrifying, spider-like agility. He spent the next 3 hours in my room. He didn't steal my laptop. He didn't touch my wallet. Instead, he picked up my toothbrush and ran it over his teeth. He sat in my desk chair and stared at my bed for 40 minutes, unmoving. Then, he went to my closet, took out my favorite sweater, and put it on. He lay down on my bed, tucked himself under the covers, and closed his eyes, staying there until minutes before I was due to return. The most chilling part was the end. Before he crawled back behind the wardrobe, he looked directly into the hidden camera. He didn't look surprised. He smiled, a wide, toothless grin, and tapped his wrist where a watch would be. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and my phone and bolted down the stairs. I didn't even stop to talk to Henderson. I ran 3 blocks before I dared to look back. I called the police from a 7-Eleven. When they searched the house, they found the crawl space. It wasn't just a storage area. It was a labyrinth of narrow tunnels that ran throughout the entire house, behind the walls of every bedroom. Inside the tunnels, they found nests, pallets made of stolen clothing, half-eaten food, and dozens of photographs of the various tenants who had lived there over the years. But they didn't find the man, and they didn't find Mr. Henderson. The house, it turned out, was registered to a shell company that had been defunct for a decade. The man I thought was the landlord was just another resident of the walls. The police found a ledger in the crawl space. It was a schedule, meticulously handwritten. It listed my name, my class schedule, and my sleep patterns. Under the date of that night, there was a single note. "Julian is leaving early. Prepare the basement." I never went back for my things. I live in a modern high-rise now with concrete walls and no crawl spaces. But sometimes, when the wind hits the building just right, I hear a faint, rhythmic ticking. And I find myself checking the alignment of my chairs every single morning just to make sure they haven't moved 2 inches to the left. I've worked the night shift at Miller's 24-hour auto for 6 years. I like it. No customers complaining about the price of oil, no boss breathing down my neck. Just me, the smell of grease, and the hum of the hydraulic lifts. But 3 months ago, a black sedan changed everything. It was 2:45 a.m. A man towed it in himself, which was the first red flag. Usually, people call a wrecking service. He was tall, wearing a tan overcoat that didn't fit the greasy environment of a garage, and he kept his hands in his pockets. He told me the fuel pump was shot and he needed it fixed by morning. "Money is no object," he said, dropping a wad of hundreds on the counter. Just don't open the trunk. The latch is broken and it's full of sensitive legal documents for a case tomorrow. I should have just taken the money and done the job, but curiosity is a mechanic's curse. By 4 a.m., I had the sedan up on the lift. As I was working underneath it, my flashlight caught something caught in the rear suspension. It was a piece of fabric. I pulled it out. It was a small, pink hair ribbon, damp and stained with something dark and sticky. My stomach did a slow roll. I looked up at the undercarriage of the trunk. There were small, frantic dents in the metal, pushed outward from the inside. I lowered the lift. I knew I should call the police, but I needed to be sure. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he'd hit a deer, or maybe the legal documents were just heavy. I grabbed a crowbar. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. The trunk didn't have a broken latch. It had been reinforced with heavy-duty internal bolts. I wedged the crowbar in and heaved. The metal groaned and finally snapped. The trunk didn't contain legal documents. It was empty except for a small, handheld camcorder and a child's backpack. I opened the backpack. Inside was a school notebook with the name Emily written in glittery letters. And then I turned on the camcorder. The screen flickered to life. It was a recording of a bedroom, a little girl's bedroom. The camera was steady, clearly mounted on a tripod. The date stamp on the video was from only 4 hours ago. I watched in frozen horror as the man in the tan overcoat entered the frame, walked over to the sleeping girl, and whispered something in her ear before the video cut to black. A shadow fell over the garage floor. "I told you not to open the trunk, Leo." I spun around. The man was standing in the bay door. He wasn't wearing the overcoat anymore. He was in a dark jumpsuit and he was holding a silenced pistol. He wasn't even angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher catching a student cheating. "I liked you, Leo. You're a good mechanic, but you're too nosy for this world." I didn't think. I grabbed a heavy torque wrench from the bench and hurled it at the light fixtures above him. The garage plunged into near total darkness, save for the flickering red exit sign. I dove under the car on the lift. Foot. 2 rounds hissed through the air, sparking off the metal frame of the sedan. I knew the garage better than he did. I crawled through the shadows, moving toward the compressor room. I could hear his footsteps, slow, rhythmic, heavy. He was mocking me. "You can't stay under there forever," he called out. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "The police won't be here for hours. It's just you and me." I reached the air compressor and fumbled for the hose. I didn't have a weapon, but I had 150 psi of pressurized air. As he rounded the corner of the lift, I aimed the nozzle at a stack of empty oil drums behind him and let out a massive blast. The drums crashed down with a deafening roar. He flinched, turning toward the noise. That was my only chance. I sprinted for the back office, locked the door, and dived for the phone. But the line was dead. He'd cut the wires before coming back. The office door rattled. Then came the sound of a shoulder hitting the wood. Thud, thud. I looked at the desk. My car keys were there. My old Chevy truck was parked right outside the office window. I grabbed a heavy stapler, smashed the window glass, and tumbled out into the cold night air just as the office door gave way. I scrambled into my truck, the engine screaming as I floored it in reverse. I saw him in the rearview mirror, standing in the broken window, raising the gun. A bullet shattered my side mirror, but I didn't stop. I drove straight to the police station 3 miles away. When they went back, the garage was empty. The black sedan was gone. The man was gone. My boss's office had been wiped clean. No security footage, no paperwork. Even the hundreds of dollars he'd left on the counter were gone. The only thing the police found was the pink hair ribbon I'd tucked into my pocket. But every night since then, when I'm locking up my own house, I check the underside of my car. And every time I hear a car tow a vehicle in during the night shift, I don't go out to meet them. I stay in the office with the door locked and I wait for the sun to come up. Because I know he's still out there. And I know he still has my name on a work order. I work in cybersecurity, which is the ultimate irony considering what happened to me. I'm the guy who tells people to change their passwords and use two-factor authentication. I thought my house was a fortress. I had the latest smart locks, cloud-connected cameras, and a voice-controlled thermostat that learned my schedule. I liked the control. I liked the convenience. It started with the temperature. I'd come home from work and the house would be a stifling 80 degrees. I checked my app. It said I had manually adjusted it at 2 p.m. But I was in a meeting at 2 p.m. and my phone was in my pocket. I figured it was a glitch, a bug in the latest firmware update. I reset the system and went to bed. 2 nights later, at 3:15 a.m., the smart speaker in the kitchen turned on. Not to play music, but at full volume, blasting white noise. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I ran to the kitchen, shouting at it to stop. It didn't respond to my voice. I had to unplug it. My hands were shaking. When I checked the logs the next morning, there was no record of the device being activated. That was when the paranoia set in. I changed every password. I wiped the hub. I felt better for about 48 hours. Then came the doorbell ghost. My phone would buzz at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 4 a.m. Person detected at front door. Every time I checked the live feed, the porch was empty. Just the silent street and the swaying branches of the oak tree. I assumed it was a spider crawling over the lens or a moth attracted to the infrared light. But on Friday, I stayed up. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the front door through the gap in the hallway. My phone buzzed. Person detected. I looked at the screen. Empty porch. Then I looked at the actual door. The handle was turning. Slowly, methodically. Someone wasn't standing in front of the camera. They were standing to the side, leaning over, reaching for the lock while staying in the blind spot they somehow knew existed. I didn't call out. I called 911. I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door with a physical deadbolt, the only thing in the house not connected to the internet. While I was on the phone with the operator, every light in the house suddenly turned on. Then they started stroking, a sickening strobe effect. My smart oven started preheating. The sprinklers in the yard went off. The intruder wasn't just trying to get in. He was playing with the house. He was showing me he owned it. The police arrived in 6 minutes. They found no one on the porch, but the back door, the one with the expensive smart lock, was wide open. The lock hadn't been picked. It had been authorized. Someone had sent a digital command to unlock it at 3:22 a.m. The detective was a young guy, tech-savvy. He looked at my router and then at a small, black box plugged into an outlet behind my TV that I didn't recognize. "Is this yours?" he asked. It wasn't. It was a bridge, a hardware exploit that had been physically planted in my house weeks ago. Probably by the repairman who came to fix my cable in October. He hadn't just hacked my Wi-Fi, he'd built a backdoor into my entire life. But the real chill came when they analyzed the footage from the internal cameras, the ones I used to check on my dog. They found a file that had been hidden in a subfolder. It was a recording from the camera in my bedroom taken 3 nights prior. The video showed me sleeping. About 20 minutes into the clip, a man crawls out from under my bed. He doesn't steal anything, he doesn't touch me. He just stands there, inches from my face, holding his phone up. On the phone's screen, I could see my own smart home app. He spends 10 minutes quietly adjusting the thermostat and the lights, watching my face to see if I wake up. Before he crawls back under the bed, he leans down and whispers something into the baby monitor on my nightstand. the police enhanced the audio. "You should have used a physical key, Elias." They never caught him. I moved out the next day. I live in a cabin now. No Wi-Fi, no smart lights, no voice assistants. I have a heavy iron key that stays around my neck and a dog that sleeps at the foot of my bed. People call me a Luddite. They say I'm overreacting. But sometimes, when it's very quiet, I find myself staring at the smoke detector on the ceiling. It has a tiny green light that blinks every 30 seconds. And I wonder, who is on the other side of that blink? There is a specific kind of silence that exists only on a farm in late August. It's a heavy, expectant silence, thick with the smell of drying corn silk and the hum of cicadas that sounds like a live wire. My family has farmed this patch of dirt in Iowa for 4 generations, but I've never seen the corn act the way it did that summer. It started on a Tuesday. I woke up at 4 a.m. to the sound of the dogs, 2 massive blue heelers named Buck and Blue, whining at the back door. Normally, they'd be barking at a stray coyote or a raccoon, but this was different. It was a low, submissive whimper. When I opened the door, they didn't run out. They pushed their way into the kitchen, tails tucked, and hid under the oak table. I grabbed my shotgun and a heavy-duty flashlight, thinking a mountain lion might have wandered down from the north. I stepped out onto the porch. The air felt charged, like a storm was about to break, but the sky was crystal clear, a vast dome of indifferent stars. I shone the light toward the edge of the north field, the one we call the dead acre because the soil is a bit thinner there. The corn was 10 feet tall, a wall of gold and green, but it wasn't swaying, it was vibrating. I walked down the porch steps, the gravel crunching under my boots like breaking bone. As I reached the edge of the field, the vibration grew into a low-frequency hum that I felt in my teeth. I stepped into the rows. The corn was bent, not broken, not snapped, bent into perfect, fluid curves, creating a path that led deeper into the heart of the crop. I followed it. I knew I shouldn't, but the curiosity was a physical weight. After about 50 yards, the corn opened up into a circle. It was perfect, a 60-foot radius where every single stalk had been flattened in a clockwise spiral. In the center of the circle sat a pile of birds, dozens of them, crows, sparrows, hawks, all dead but with no visible injuries. They were arranged in a pattern, a series of concentric circles pointing toward the farmhouse. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was terrifying. I felt a cold prickle on my neck. I looked up. Above the field, a section of the stars was missing. There was no ship, no flashing lights, just a void, a triangular patch of absolute blackness that moved slowly, silently, blotting out the constellations as it drifted toward my house. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the porch. I locked the doors, pulled the curtains, and sat in the kitchen with the healers. We sat there for hours. Every few minutes, I'd hear a thud on the roof. 1, 2, 3, like someone was dropping heavy stones onto the shingles. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. The void was gone. But when I looked at the roof of my house, I found the stones. They were the birds from the field. Dozens of them, perfectly arranged in a circle around the chimney. I went to the north field to show the sheriff, but when we got there, the circle was gone. The corn wasn't flattened anymore. It was standing tall, as if nothing had ever happened. But as I walked through the rows, I noticed something that made me drop my canteen. The corn was different. Every stalk in that 60-foot circle had turned white. Not dead white, but a shimmering, translucent pearl color. And when I touched one, it felt like cold glass. That night, the radio in the barn started playing. It wasn't connected to a battery. It played a series of rhythmic clicks and whistles, and then a voice that sounded like my father, who had been dead for 10 years. "Don't look at the sky, son," the voice whispered through the static. They've already mapped the basement. I sold the farm a month later. The new owners told me the corn grew back thicker than ever the next year, but they mentioned one strange thing. At night, the dogs wouldn't go near the north field, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, the rustling of the corn sounds exactly like a crowd of people whispering a name. My name. My father was a man of few words and even fewer friends. He ran our wheat farm in northern Montana like a military operation. But there was one ritual that baffled me. Every spring, on the night of the spring equinox, he would go into the old shed, a place I was strictly forbidden to enter, and emerge with the warden. The warden was the most disturbing scarecrow I had ever seen. It wasn't made of straw and burlap. Its frame was made of heavy, black iron, and its body was wrapped in layers of cured pig hide that had been stitched together with copper wire. It had no face, just a flat, smooth head of leather. But the most unsettling part was the height. The warden stood nearly 9 feet tall, with arms that ended in long, rusted, iron sickles. "It's not for the crows, Silas," my father would say, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's for the things that crawl when the wheat is high. It's a trade. We give it a place to stand, and it keeps the shadows out of our house." I laughed at his superstition until the year I turned 19, the year my father died. I buried him on the hill, and in my grief and arrogance, I decided the rituals were over. I took a chainsaw to the old shed. I wanted that iron monstrosity gone. But when I broke down the door, the shed was empty. The warden was already out in the field, standing on its pedestal, even though I hadn't moved it. The wheat grew unnaturally fast that year. By July, it was over my head, a golden ocean that seemed to hiss whenever the wind blew. And then, the disappearances started. First, the livestock. We found a cow in the middle of the field, or what was left of her. She hadn't been eaten, she had been surgically dismantled, her organs laid out in a perfect line between the rows of wheat. Then, I started hearing the sound. It wasn't a voice, it was a rhythmic, metallic clink, 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 like iron hitting stone. One night, a heavy fog rolled off the mountains, thick as wool. I stood on the porch, a lantern in my hand, and looked toward the center of the field where the warden stood. In the fog, the silhouette looked different. It wasn't stiff. It was swaying, but not with the wind. It was leaning forward, as if it were sniffing the air. I walked into the wheat, my shotgun trembling in my grip. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The wheat stalks felt like cold, damp fingers brushing against my face. When I reached the pedestal, my heart nearly stopped. The warden was there, but the pig hide was split open. It was hollow, empty. A shadow moved to my left. I swung the lantern. 20 feet away, standing between the stalks, was something that looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. It was wearing my father's old denim jacket, but the sleeves were shredded by the long, rusted iron sickles that grew out of its wrists. It turned toward me. It still had no face, just that smooth, stitched leather head. But now there were 2 glowing amber slits where the eyes should be. "The trade is broken, Silas," a voice rasped. It sounded like metal grinding against metal. "Your father kept the hunger fed. You offered nothing." It moved with a speed that defied physics. It didn't run, it glided through the wheat, the iron sickles whistling through the air. I fired both barrels, but the lead just thudded into the leather hide like it was hitting sand. I ran for the house, the clink, 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 right at my heels. I burst through the front door and slammed it, shoving the heavy oak dresser against it. I spent the night in the attic, watching the wheat field through a telescope. Under the moonlight, I saw them. Not just one, dozens of shadows, tall and spindly, emerging from the rows of wheat. They gathered around the farmhouse, their iron limbs scratching against the siding. They weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. The next morning, I found a small pile of copper wire on my doorstep, arranged in the shape of a heart. I understood then. The warden wasn't a protector. It was a gatekeeper. My father hadn't been keeping the shadows out. He had been paying a tax. And now that he was gone, the tax had increased. I didn't leave. I couldn't. Every time I tried to drive down the road, the wheat would rise up, tangling in the wheels of my truck, the iron sickles slashing my tires. I live here now. I've reopened the old shed. Every month I have to find something to feed the warden. It started with the remaining cattle, then the stray dogs. But the wheat is getting hungry again, and its whispers are getting louder, calling my name in my father's voice. I'm looking at the warden now from the kitchen window. It's standing closer to the house today. It's wearing my father's hat now, and it's pointing one of those rusted sickles directly at my bedroom window. The trade must be honored, and I'm the only thing left on the farm. My grandfather used to say that a farm is like a person. It has a face it shows the neighbors, and a stomach that is never quite full. I never understood what he meant until I inherited the property in rural Pennsylvania. It was a sprawling, neglected piece of land with a barn that leaned dangerously to the west and a farmhouse that felt like it was constantly exhaling cold air. But the most peculiar thing was the root cellar. It wasn't attached to the house. It sat alone in the middle of a barren patch of dirt behind the barn, a heavy iron door set into a mound of earth secured by 3 separate slide bolts. My grandfather's will was explicit. Check the bolts every sundown, never open it after dark, and if you hear a scratching sound like dry leaves, walk away, do not listen. For the first month, I followed the rules. I'm a city man by trade, and the quiet of the country made me paranoid enough to obey even the most senile-sounding instructions. Every evening, just as the sun dipped behind the jagged tree line, I would walk out to that mound of dirt and slam the iron bolts home. Clack, clack, clack. But isolation does strange things to the mind. You start looking for patterns where there are none, and you start questioning the sanity of those who came before you. It was a sweltering July night when the scratching started. I was sitting on the porch, drinking a lukewarm beer, when I heard it. It wasn't dry leaves. It sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard, a frantic, rhythmic scraping coming from the direction of the barn. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the mound. The air around the cellar was cold, impossibly cold for a July night. I stood by the iron door, and then I heard the voice. It didn't come from behind the door. It felt like it vibrated up through the soles of my boots. "Benjamin, is that you? It's so dark, Ben. Help your old man." My heart stopped. Benjamin was my father. He had disappeared 20 years ago, presumed to have walked off into the woods and never come back. The voice sounded exactly like him, the same gravelly timbre, the same slight lisp on the S. "Dad?" I whispered, my hand hovering over the first bolt. "I'm so hungry, Ben. They left me down here. Your grandfather, he was afraid. Please, just one bolt." Common sense screamed at me to run, but the grief I'd carried for 2 decades was stronger. I slid the first bolt back. The iron was so cold it burned my skin. Screech. The scratching stopped instantly. "That's it, son. Just 2 more. I have so much to tell you, about where the money is, about why I left." As I reached for the second bolt, I noticed something in the dirt. My flashlight beam hit the area around the door. The ground was littered with bones. Small ones at first, rabbits, squirrels. But then I saw a deer's skull crushed like an eggshell. And then I saw a boot. A weathered leather work boot, exactly like the ones my grandfather used to wear. It was still tied, but there was no foot inside. Just a jagged, splintered piece of bone sticking out of the leather. I froze. My grandfather didn't die of old age in his sleep. He had been taken. Suddenly, the voice changed. It wasn't my father anymore. It was a chaotic mess of sounds, a dozen voices all speaking at once, overlapping, echoing, like a crowd in a small room. "Open it! Open it! Open it!" The iron door began to bulge outward, as if something immense was pressing against it from the other side. The second bolt, the one I hadn't touched, snapped like a toothpick. I turned and ran. I didn't go to the house. I knew the house wouldn't hold. I ran for my truck, the gravel flying under my feet. Behind me, I heard the final bolt shatter. The sound was like a gunshot. Then came a wet, heavy thud, the sound of something massive and soft hitting the dirt. I jumped into the truck and floored it. As I sped down the long driveway, my headlights swept across the field behind the barn. I saw it for a split second. It wasn't a person, it was a mass of pale, translucent limbs, dozens of them, all fused together into a mound of twitching flesh. It had no face, just a series of vertical slits that opened and closed like gills. And from those slits, it was still screaming in my father's voice. I didn't stop until I reached the state police barracks. They went back the next morning, but the cellar was empty. The iron door was lying 20 feet away, twisted like a piece of tinfoil. The inside of the cellar was nothing but a hole in the ground, lined with smooth, blackened stone that smelled of sulfur. I never went back to the farm. I sold the land to a developer for a fraction of its value. Last I heard, they tried to build a housing complex there, but the workers refused to stay on site after dark. They said they kept hearing voices coming from the drainage pipes, voices that sounded like their own children, crying for help from somewhere deep underground. I still have the key to the farmhouse. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear a soft scratching on my bedroom door. I don't answer it, I just sit in the dark and wait for the sun to come up. Because I know that once you hear the stomach of the farm, it never stops growling for you. The rain in Blackwood Bay didn't fall. It drifted in a salty, gray mist that got under your skin and stayed there. It was a place of rusted shipwrecks and people who wanted to be forgotten. David wasn't there to be forgotten. He was there to find his sister, Sarah. She had moved to the coast 6 months ago for a research job at a private marine station. Her letters had been frequent, filled with sketches of tide pools and descriptions of the local fog. Then, 3 weeks ago, they stopped. No phone calls, no emails, just a final cryptic postcard with a picture of a lighthouse and one sentence: "The water remembers everything." David stood in front of a rented cottage, a shack perched on rotting stilts over the mudflats. The padlock on the door had been forced open, not by a crowbar, but by something heavy and blunt. Inside, the cottage was freezing. It smelled of brine and wet wool. David flicked his flashlight around the room. Sarah's journals were gone. Her laptop was gone. But on the kitchen table sat a single glass of water, filled to the brim. Next to it was a small, perfectly round stone from the beach. He pulled out his phone. No signal. There was never a signal in Blackwood. David headed down to the Anchor, the only pub in town. It was a low-ceilinged room filled with the smell of old tobacco and fried fish. The locals stopped talking the moment he stepped inside. "I'm looking for Sarah Thorne," David said, sliding a photo across the bar. "She lived in the cottage on the flats." The bartender, a man whose face looked like a crumpled map, didn't even look at the photo. "Cottage is empty, lad. Has been for a month." "That's impossible," David countered, his voice tight. "I have a postcard from her dated 2 weeks ago." A man in the corner, wearing a faded yellow fisherman's slicker, looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but he seemed to be looking right through David. "The tide took her," the old man rasped. "The station don't like visitors, and the water don't like secrets." Before David could ask what the station was, the man stood up and walked out into the rain. David couldn't sleep. He stayed in a small motel at the edge of town, the walls so thin he could hear the Atlantic pounding the shore like a rhythmic drum. At 2:14 a.m., a sound woke him, a wet, dragging noise right outside his door. Slap, drag, slap, drag. He gripped a heavy flashlight and crept to the window. In the pale moonlight, he saw a trail of dark, wet sand leading from the beach straight to his door. And there, standing at the edge of the parking lot, was the man in the yellow slicker. He wasn't moving. He was just pointing toward the northern cliffs where the ruins of the old Victorian lighthouse stood. The same lighthouse from Sarah's last postcard. David threw on his jacket and grabbed his car keys, but when he tried to start his engine, it just sputtered. He popped the hood. Every single wire had been meticulously cut. Not shredded, cut. Someone didn't want him to leave. But more importantly, someone didn't want him to drive. They wanted him to walk. Into the dark. Into the salt. David didn't wait for dawn. Carrying a heavy wrench from his car's trunk and his flashlight, he began the 3-mile trek toward the northern cliffs. The path was a narrow ribbon of crumbling limestone. Below, the Atlantic surged, white foam looking like bared teeth in the darkness. The lighthouse wasn't a romantic ruin. It was a tomb of rusted iron and shattered glass. As David approached, he noticed something odd. The ground around the base was cleared of weeds. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud, wide, heavy treads of a luxury SUV, totally out of place in this impoverished fishing village. He stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cleaning supplies, bleach. He climbed the spiral staircase, his boots echoing like gunshots. On the 3rd floor, he found a small room that had been converted into a makeshift office. It was surgically clean, except for one thing: a small silver earring lying under a metal radiator. David picked it up. His stomach dropped. He had bought these for Sarah's graduation. There was dried blood on the clasp. Then he heard the floorboards creak behind him. David spun around, swinging the wrench, but he stopped mid-motion. Standing in the doorway wasn't a weathered fisherman or a crazed cultist. It was a man in a charcoal gray suit, looking as if he'd just stepped out of a boardroom in London. "You were always the impulsive one, David," the man said softly. David's breath hitched. Mark? Mark was Sarah's ex-fiancé, a high-level consultant for a pharmaceutical conglomerate. David had always thought Mark was a bit cold, but he was family, or he had been until Sarah broke off the engagement a year ago. "What are you doing here, Mark? Where is she?" Mark sighed, stepping into the room. 2 men in tactical gear appeared behind him, their faces obscured by shadows. "Sarah didn't move here for research, David. She moved here to hide. She stole something from the firm, data that belongs to people who don't understand the word no. I was sent to facilitate its return." "You kidnapped her," David whispered, the reality hitting him harder than the cold wind outside. "You didn't come to help her. You tracked her down." "I came to save her life," Mark corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "If I didn't find her first, the firm would have sent people far less polite than me. But she's stubborn. She won't tell me where the drives are." "Where is she, Mark? Tell me right now, or I swear to God." David started forward, but one of the men in shadows stepped in, a flash of taser light illuminating the room. David hit the floor, his muscles seizing in an agonizing white heat. When he could breathe again, he was tied to a heavy wooden chair. Mark was sitting across from him, looking at Sarah's final postcard. "The water remembers everything," Mark read aloud. "That's not poetry, David. That's a location." There's an old diving bell submerged about 200 yards off the pier. She hid the data there, didn't she? She knew you'd eventually figure it out." "I don't know what you're talking about," David gasped, his tongue feeling like lead. Mark leaned in close. "I think you do. And I think if I start making Sarah scream in the room downstairs, your memory will improve very quickly." A muffled cry echoed from beneath the floorboards. It was Sarah. She wasn't at a station or a research facility. She had been right here, 3 floors down, listening to David arrive. Mark stood up and signaled to his men. "Bring her up. Let's see how much brotherly love is worth in Bitcoin." The door to the room creaked open and the 2 men dragged Sarah in. She was a ghost of her former self, her hair matted with salt, her face bruised, but her eyes, when they met David's, were burning with a fierce, cold intelligence. "David," she whispered. Her voice was a broken rasp. "I'm sorry, Sarah," David choked out, struggling against the zip ties cutting into his wrists. "I followed the postcard." Mark knelt between them, holding a small, encrypted tablet. "Enough reunions. The diving bell, Sarah. The tide is coming in. In 2 hours, that bell will be 30 feet under churning silt. If my divers don't have the coordinates now, they'll never find it. And if they don't find it, neither of you leaves this lighthouse." Sarah looked at David, then at Mark. A small, bloody smile touched her lips. "The coordinates are on the stone, Mark. The one I left in the cottage." Mark stiffened. He signaled one of his men, who spoke into a radio. "The stone in the cottage. Get it, now." While the men were distracted, Sarah leaned toward David. "The wrench," she breathed, almost silent. David felt it. He had dropped the heavy iron wrench right next to his chair when he was tasered. It was inches from his foot. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled. "Sir, we have the stone. There's a micro-engraving on the base. We're heading to the pier." Mark stood up, smoothing his suit. "You see, everyone has a price. Usually, it's just the life of someone they love." He turned to his guards. "Clean this up. Make it look like a tragic accident. A brother and sister swept off the cliffs by a rogue wave. Very common in Blackwood Bay." Mark turned to leave, but he made a mistake. He walked too close to David. In one explosive movement, David hooked the wrench with his boot, flipped it into his bound hands, and lunged. He didn't go for Mark. He swung the heavy iron with all his might at the gas-powered heater in the corner of the room. The valve snapped. The hiss of pressurized propane filled the small space instantly. "Sarah, run!" David screamed. One of the guards pulled a gun, but Mark shouted, "Don't shoot! You'll blow us all to hell!" In the chaos, Sarah dived through the doorway. She had spent months exploring this lighthouse. She knew the service chute in the hallway. David, still tied to the chair, kicked the guard in the knee and threw his weight against the door, jamming the wrench into the handle from the inside. David was trapped inside with Mark and the 2 guards. The room was thick with gas. Outside, he could hear Sarah's frantic footsteps fading as she scrambled down the rocks toward the hidden boat she had kept for her escape. Mark's face was pale, his composure gone. "David, open the door. We can all walk out. I'll let her go, I swear." David sat back in his chair, his heart rate slowing down. Through the window, he could see a single light on the water, Sarah's boat. She was moving. She was safe. "You don't get it, Mark," David said, his voice calm, almost peaceful. "You're the architect of absence, but today, you're just another secret for the water to keep." He reached into his pocket. He didn't have a lighter. He didn't need one. He grabbed the heavy industrial flashlight he had been carrying. The casing was cracked from the struggle. "Sarah has the data," David whispered, "and she has your signature on the lease of this station. You're done." David flicked the switch on the broken flashlight.
A tiny internal spark jumped across the damaged wiring. The explosion was a brief, brilliant star on the northern cliffs of Blackwood Bay. From her boat, a mile out at sea, Sarah watched the top of the lighthouse vanish into a plume of orange fire and falling stone. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She gripped the tiller of the boat until her knuckles turned white. In her pocket was the real drive. The diving bell was empty, a decoy for a man who thought he was smarter than he was. The water remembers everything, David had once told her when they were children. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of bruised purple and gold, Sarah turned the boat toward the open ocean. She was alive, but the cost was a hole in her world that the sea would never fill. Behind her, the lighthouse was silent. The mist returned, thick and gray, swallowing the ruins until it looked as if nothing had ever happened at all.